April was an incredible reading month. I finished 8 books across a wide variety of genres, and my lowest rated book was 4 stars. So here are the 8 books that I read in April. So as always with these short reviews, I will group them by genre and put chapters below and save my book of the month for last. So The Pastures of Heaven by John Steinbeck was Steinbeck's second published work, and the learning curve from his first book to this one was quite remarkable. I read his first book, Cup of Gold, back in December, I think, and frankly, of the 15 books I've read by Steinbeck, it's the one I probably wouldn't really recommend. But this is great, and this is probably one of his more underrated works because, except for the great discussion I had with Joanna and Evie and Carlos about this book, I don't see anybody talking about The Pastures of Heaven. But The Pastures of Heaven was great. It is technically interconnected short stories, or I think Joanna pointed out in our discussion that he called it a short story cycle. And that works a little bit better because they are linked, and they're linked by setting. So the setting is the Pastures of Heaven, which is in Steinbeck's Salinas Valley of California, which is a setting that he does revisit a lot in his career. And you do see a lot of the kind of precursors of the things that would become part of Steinbeck's kind of signature style. The setting, of course, the Pastures of Heaven is one of those, the Salinas Valley in particular. But you also start to see how great he is a character. One thing that I think is a tough thing to do is for a short fiction writer to give you great characterization. I think it's a lot harder in the short form to really flesh out characters, and Steinbeck does a really tremendous job in all of these stories because of the 10 stories in the middle, there's technically 12 stories here, but the first and last one are kind of like bookends that are more about the pastures themselves. The 10 stories within have different protagonists. And while there is a family called the Monroes that permeate all of these stories and link all these stories together, you get a different main character in all of these stories. And Steinbeck does a great job in just about every one of these stories in bringing out these characters. And I thought it was pretty admirable that he was able to do that so well. There are other parts of this that harken to later Steinbeck as well, kind of the very human, you hear the everyman or every person types of characters that he creates. A lot of those in this story, these people feel flawed, they feel human, and he's real good about putting them in difficult situations. In fact, some of this collection's kind of dark, and I really enjoyed it anyway, but it's a really good collection, and I think it's very underrated. It wouldn't be my recommendation for an entry point for Steinbeck, but if you've already read Steinbeck and you've enjoyed his writing, which probably you have if you've read Steinbeck, I would definitely persuade you to pick up The Pastures of Heaven. It's a pretty quick read, and if you like kind of the idea of a short story cycle of stories, Pastures of Heaven is one that you'll probably enjoy. From one favorite author to another, Haruki Murakami's latest book is The City and Its Uncertain Walls. It came out last year. And it shares a setting in one of his earlier books of hard-boiled wonderland and the end of the world. Really memorable, very fantastical story. Well, this is a kind of a peculiar book, but honestly, I could say that about most of Murakami's books. But the style of it being peculiar is not kind of like the outlandish ways like some of his other stories that there are just all these really surreal elements thrown together, but in the way that this book is structured. And you find out why when you know the backstory of this, and that it's in 3 parts, and the first part of this book was a novella that Murakami wrote decades ago. And at various points he would come back to this novella and kind of rework it and think about incorporating it into other things. And then he finally wrote this novel kind of continuing the story. But this first novella sets up the story. It's about a young man who's in love with a young woman. The young woman disappears, and he recalls a conversation that he had with the young woman where she says if she ever disappears, she'll be in this city that has a wall around it, and she'll be working in the library, and she may not remember her life. And of course, that's a perfect Murakami setup. But the writing in this first novella, for it being decades old, is pretty remarkable. There's some great instances of second person that are used so effectively, and it made me really, really connect with this young man. The rest of the story is his kind of pursuit to try to find out what happened. And I found the last half of it maybe a little less compelling than the first half. In fact, when we got into the city and its uncertain walls, it was a little bit less interesting to me. Maybe because we've seen the setting before and we've seen kind of some of the things that Murakami talks about there. We've seen that before with his writing. But I still really enjoyed it. There was a small allusion to the Wind-Up Bird Chronicle, which made me happy because that's one of my favorite works by Murakami. I wouldn't put this in the upper echelon of Murakami, but I also wouldn't put it in the bottom. I think it's kind of a middle book for him, which means it's very good. I can definitely recommend it. Maybe not as an entry point to this author, but I definitely enjoyed my time. The thing with Murakami is no matter what he writes about, he just has this writing style that just mesmerizes me. I get immersed so easily in his books, probably more easily than any other author that I've ever read. So I did enjoy The City and Its Uncertain Walls by Haruki Murakami. Chaos and Order by Stephen R. Donaldson is the fourth book in the Gap Cycle series. This is a 5-book series that is a grimdark space opera. I've read one per month this year, and I'm looking to finish the series next month. So I was so glad that this was a step above the third book. The third book was my least favorite in the series because, frankly, it was a bit bloated. And some of it does sink in here a little bit, but not as bad. There's one aspect of Donaldson's style that I don't like, at least in this series. I need to read more to see if it's elsewhere, but in this series, there are many chapters of primarily two characters having a conversation about events that they don't know what's going on, and they're conjecturing about it. And they make guesses, and then it comes back to the end that they just don't know what's going on. And honestly, it's kind of a colossal waste of time, and I wish he would have had a stronger editor to cut those out. There are several of them in the third book, and there are a few in this book as well, because it grinds the narrative to a dead halt. And once I noticed this and noticed exactly what was going on, I tried to focus in on Donaldson's writing to see, okay, is there something more here that I'm missing? Is he giving you really important character information? Is there something thematically he's analyzing? So when I got to these chapters, I actually purposely slowed down to try to see if that was the case, and I never discovered that. So I feel that they were just a little bit too many in these two books and a little bit more bloated. But thankfully, this book, the overall story kept moving forward. And you kind of get the story. It's in kind of 4 different parts. And it's kind of leading towards these 4 spaceships converging. And there's probably going to be a space battle. And there is, and it's epic. And there's some really cool things in the space battle I've never seen in this genre before. So I really enjoyed that part of it. Probably my biggest disappointment with this series, though, is that he mentions how he was highly influenced by The Ring of the Nibelung, the opera cycle by Richard Wagner, which is one of my favorite pieces of music. And the plot seems to be stuck in the first opera. So I wish he would just said, we're just going to retell Das Rheingold, because that's really kind of what's going on here. But overall, I'm glad that the trajectory of the series is back up. I do hope that continues with the 5th book, because I will say 4 books in, I like this series. I don't love this series. And I am hoping that the 5th book is fantastic, that Donaldson sticks the landing and makes the horrific violence at the beginning of the series something that was worth reading by having just a really great ending. I guess time will tell. I will be reading the 5th book sometime in May. The Final Score by Don Winslow is Winslow's latest book. He had said he was going to retire, and then, like most authors, he just felt compelled to write. And this is a collection of shorter fiction. There are 5 short stories and 1 novella in this collection. So in many ways, it's like the collection Broken, which I read sometime last year. This is fantastic. One thing that I really love about both of these collections is that it really shows that Winslow is an author with scope. I think a lot of genre fiction writers, they find their lane and they write in their lane. Well, this collection has such diversity of stories, diversity of tone, and diversity of writing style, which I greatly admire authors that are able to do that. Some of the stronger ones in here, The Final Score has to do, it's a typical work of crime fiction where you have kind of an older criminal who's about to go to prison for life. He wants to do that one last score to set up his family for life. That was a really good one. There's a more lighthearted one in here that has a lot of heart about basically a high school kid whose job is to deliver liquor on Sundays because the liquor stores are closed in New England on Sundays. And that was kind of a really delightful tale, and I really enjoyed that one. There's one in here that really shows the skill of the author because there's one short story in here that is nothing but two characters having a conversation. And the remarkable part of it is he never says he said, she said, or he said, this character said. You're able to tell just because of the strong voices he provided both characters the entire time in this whole story, which is nothing but dialogue. You're able to tell who's talking at every time. And it feels like a conversation that just flows the way conversations do. Really, really great. The crown jewel, though, is the novella called Collision, which is basically a story about a criminal whose criminal world collides with his family life. And it was really good. Some fantastic twists. This would be a great entry point to this author. It's not that thick. This one or Broken, I think, are both great entry points because, again, you can see just the skill that this author has. And Winslow just continues to rise in my estimation, and I can't wait to read more by him later this year. The Black Ice by Michael Connelly is Connelly's second novel. If you missed my video from a week or two ago, I'm starting a Michael Connelly reading project on the channel where I'm going to be rereading all of his novels and giving reviews. And this is his second novel, and I'm going to review them two at a time. So you can look for a more detailed review of The Black Echo, that's Donnelly's debut, and The Black Ice sometime in the next couple weeks. I will be putting that video out. Those videos will be spoiler-free, and I'll also talk about in each of those whether or not I think the book is a viable entry point into the author. I've given a general, you can start anywhere with this author recommendation in the past, but I think you can go a little bit deeper in this series that I'm going to be doing, these series of videos. So I'll give you a little bit more detail about whether or not a book might be a great entry point. But The Black Ice is another Harry Bosch novel. Harry Bosch is an LAPD detective, and this is kind of a pretty straightforward murder mystery type of story, where at the very beginning we see Bosch at a crime scene where a body is discovered, and it's an undercover narcotics officer. So he has to determine, is it suicide? Is it homicide? Was the officer still on the up and up? Had he turned? Had he been dirty and was trying to turn back? Trying to discover all those things. However, the LAPD brass seems to just want to close the case really quickly and sweep it under the rug. But even 2 books into reading the Harry Bosch novels, you know that that's not how Bosch works. He seeks the truth all of the time, which of course comes with the consternation of his superior officers. They don't like that a whole lot. So they try to load him down with some other cases, but he continues to investigate this story. And Black Ice is a drug that's on the street, so this does have kind of a cartel feel to it. At one point, Bosch goes to Mexicali to investigate that way as well. It's a really great Bosch story. It's extremely well plotted. He has his signature plot twist in here that is 100% plausible, and one of those that, just like the great mystery writers do, you can look back and see the breadcrumbs. It's a really fantastic story, a great Bosch novel. So Black Ice, definitely recommend it. Not the best entry point, I will say that here before I do that next video, but I think it could be an entry point. But it's definitely a great Connelly novel, which he's Mr. Consistent, so most of them are pretty great. Return to Edan by Philip Chase is the conclusion of the Edan trilogy, and this was a reread for me, and I actually didn't reread this book, but I could hold it up. I reread via audiobook the recent release of the audiobook narrated by Alan Walker from the Library of Alexandria. One thing that, when I went into rereading this trilogy, the thing that I thought most about this trilogy is how each book got better, and that this one stuck the landing, was my favorite in the series, and that remained true in this reread. And I think in many ways, the narration as well. And it wasn't that either like first book was bad or first narration book was bad or anything like that. But I feel like Alan Walker improved throughout his narration, just like the conclusion of this story got better and better the more you knew the characters and the more that you understand how everything is coming together. The one thing I've said about Return to Edan anytime anyone's asked me about it is that what I like so much about it are 2 things. Number one, I like that it's a modern fantasy that feels very traditional. There are a lot of the trappings of traditional fantasy, but you see them through a modern lens. For instance, you see a lot more detail and a lot more nuance in the world, and a lot more nuance, especially in character. We get a lot of the characters that are not black and white, but very gray, and you certainly see that so much in this book. Some characters that you saw as villains, you start to see as more human. You start to see some characters who may have been opposed have to join together for different reasons. And I really like that level of modern fantasy kind of incorporating in what's a more traditional story. And the other thing that I really like about this, something that was reinforced in this reread, is I love when authors do a subtle but great job at characterization. What I mean is that when they write characters that you don't necessarily know that you're forming a connection to them until something happens that causes you to be emotional. This happened to me recently in a Janie Wirtz book where I got to the end of this book and a character I didn't think I was connected to, something happened and I found myself in tears. Chase does that really well in this series. There are several characters, and there were several more in the reread than even the first time I read the series, that I didn't realize I had formed kind of an emotional bond with them. And then you just keenly feel their story at the end. And I really appreciate that because it's just kind of subtle and it's probably just small beats along the way. I don't know anything technically about writing, but whatever Chase did to do this, it's something that I really admire about authors. I really love the way that this book, how everything converges at the end. It's very satisfying ending. There's a touch of bittersweet at the end of this, which I think is the best ending to anything. I think the saccharine, very, very sweet endings are not the best. They may make us feel good, but I think the ones that have a little bit of bitterness in there will often make us think about it more and appreciate the sweetness at the end of a story even more. And there's a lot of both of that in here. So if you haven't read the Edan trilogy, it's a fantastic trilogy by an indie author that has a really polished writing style. And whether you read it like this or with the fine narration from Alan Walker, I definitely give it a high recommendation. White Wolf by David Gemmell is the 10th book in the Draenei saga. There are 11 books in the Draenei saga, so I'm so excited to be at the end of this. I will also be reading the 2 prequels after I finish the regular 11 books. These Draenei books are basically all standalones, though. And they jump around the narrative, the chronology quite a bit. So this book actually takes place chronologically before the first book. And we're introduced to one of the 3 main protagonists of this series. We have 3 main protagonists in the Draenei saga. We have Druss, who we meet in the first book, who's in like 5 of the books, including this one. Waylander, who we meet in the 3rd book, who's in 3 books. And then we meet for the first time Skilgannon, who is in the last 2 books. And although I'm going to have some different reading advice, a different reading order for this series when I finally do that big summation video, one thing I've really enjoyed about publication order is seeing the evolution of Gemmell the writer. Because Legend, the first book, I love it. It's heroic fantasy. It does what it's supposed to. A lot of people bounce off of that book because the characters are a bit two-dimensional, and the storytelling's a bit over the top, and there's not a whole lot of nuance in that story. Well, by the time you get to this book, and he doesn't write these 11 in a row, he wrote other things along the way, so this represents a couple decades in between books. You see just how different his writing is. While it's still definitely heroic fantasy, you see a lot more of the kinds of shades of gray that you would expect. Skilgannon as a character is a multi-layered character, and something that Gemmell does so well in this book is he gives you his backstory, but he weaves it within the narrative that it never slows down the forward-moving plot, and it never feels like an exposition dump, even though it is. And it's really skillful the way that he did that, and I don't know if he would have been able to do that early in his career. But it's a really well-written book. My only critique with this book is the 3rd act went on a little too long. You got to a point in the book where you knew where it was going to go, and there were just a couple stops along the way that just kind of slowed things down instead of speeding them up toward the end, which is kind of what Gemmell usually does. But it was a really fantastic story, a fantastic ending with a memorable new protagonist, an old protagonist that just continues to grow on you. And I really enjoyed White Wolf and look forward to finishing the Drenai saga sometime soon. My book of the month is Hearts in Atlantis by Stephen King. So this is a reread, and this is the third time I've read this book. I actually read this and reviewed this book right at the beginning of the channel, but I'm going to unlist that video because I'm going to do a new one. But I think it was my third video on the channel. But anyway, Hearts in Atlantis is a very underrated work by King. If you would look at the GOODREADS rating, it's low. I think it's like a 3.8 or something like that. And I can see why. This is not what most King readers expect out of a book. The average King reader probably expects a work of horror that's a novel. And this is not a work of horror. There are some small, tiny horror elements in here, but not much. And it's not a novel. It's 5 interconnected stories. In fact, I read this as part of my Stephen King short fiction project, but it does work better as a continuous read rather than reading them like short stories. It actually starts with 2 novellas and ends with 3 short stories. The other thing is, this is one of King's most literary works. He sets out to tell you about the 1960s, and I think he does a tremendous job at it. It starts in the year 1960, and then each of the 5 stories progresses, and then it ends in 1999. And he's able to do so many of the things that he does extremely well here. The first novella, Low Men in Yellow Coats, is fantastic. It's magical realism, so that's King. It ties into The Dark Tower, that's King. And it's a brilliant coming-of-age story about a boy named Bobby. And you get to see a lot of the things through his eyes, and you get to experience, he's such a great author at child protagonists. And it's a fantastic story. But you also get to learn just a little bit about the 1960s through the eyes of this 11-year-old. But it's in the second story, the second novella, which is called Hearts in Atlantis, that you really get to feel what King wants to write about. Because Hearts in Atlantis is set like 9 years later, and one of the characters from the first novella is a secondary character in the second novella. And it's basically college life at the time that counterculture is rising. There's a memorable scene where a character realizes that the first time he ever saw a peace symbol. And there's just so much in here that I think King does a really great job at just giving you what it felt like to be alive in this tumultuous time with little things, little details. Like a little detail at the end of this novella, Hearts in Atlantis, there's a character who had been struggling in school, and he goes to his professors to try to work out whatever he can to just pass and not flunk out of college. And he says, looking back, he realizes his professors really wanted to help him because he knew that if he flunked out, he'd be dead in Vietnam in a year. Little things like that, just little innocuous statements, is what makes this such a rich story for me. Admittedly, the 3 short stories are not as strong as the 2 novellas, but the final short story, which is only 15 pages, brings the story full circle, adds the magical realism back in there, and frankly is one of King's finest endings. It's so good. This is such an underrated work of King's, although I do understand why people might not like this one as much because it's very, very different from most of his output, but I think it's fantastic. I urge you to read it if you haven't read it. Just go in with the proper expectations. But my book of the month, in a really great month of reading, my book of the month, April 2026, is Hearts in Atlantis by Stephen King. So, hey, that was a fantastic month. I hope your month was fantastic as well. Let me know your favorite thing that you read in April. And if you want to talk about any of these books, let's talk in the comment section below. Just please label any spoilers. If you like this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Twitter, Goodreads, and the Fireside Discord. I'd love to interact with you there. As always, thank you for watching. Until next time, goodbye.